Hello, my name is Neil Leach, and I'd like to offer some thoughts today on the nature of the doctoral thesis in the humanities. I speak as an architect, but in many ways, what I have to say applies to all the design disciplines. Broadly speaking, we could say that there are maybe three different approaches towards doctoral research in architecture and design as a whole. A science-based approach towards it, where you're working, let's say, in a lab, in a laboratory condition, and addressing things in a very controlled scientific environment. Then there is the humanities-based approach towards research, which is much more literary in the way that it approaches things, and in many ways looser than the very strict constraints of the science-based thesis. And finally, something that I'm not going to address today, but the design-based thesis, which itself has its own logic and its whole own rules. And one could even say that even between these three different models, there are many other variations that kind of fit between them in some way. Let me just say something about the scientific approach in the first place. The dominant mode of inquiry within the sciences is the scientific method, which follows a very prescribed and very fixed template, a particular way of operating, where you start off with an observational question, then look at the research topic, develop a hypothesis that you test with an experiment, then you analyze and you report the conclusions. One could claim that maybe this is itself maybe a slightly somewhat partial way of approaching things, and it's only doesn't completely test things out. It's only operating within a very restricted domain, and it also could be subject to a certain partiality in terms of the approach towards it. Perhaps the most important critique of this has been Paul Feyerabend, who's wrote a book called Against Method, where he pointed out that if we adopt such a restrictive method, we might miss out on important observations that could be developed into theories in other ways. One thinks perhaps of the observations of someone like James Lovelock, whose theory of Gaia could never be proved within a kind of a strict kind of scientific regime, but nonetheless has proved to be, in fact, in many ways, hugely inspirational and influential in the way we understand the way in which the environment operates today. In other words, we can see that there is a model proposed by the sciences that remains, and in some ways, somewhat restrictive. I certainly have suffered from this in various conferences where they have insisted that everybody follows the scientific method, whether or not it is appropriate. Let me simply say that within the realm of writing itself, there's a spectrum of different ways of writing, and we need to find a way of writing that is appropriate to the kind of research that we're doing. The spectrum broadly falls within, it goes from one end, from the kind of technical manuals about how you might fix your car or a toaster or whatever, towards the much more kind of poetic and unstructured sort of logic of a book like Ulysses by James Joyce. Could James Joyce write a technical manual? Probably not, but could the author of this book on Proton write anything like James Joyce? Almost certainly not. What I would claim within this spectrum is that scientific research lies more closely towards the end of the technical manual, and the humanities on the whole, although one cannot generalize, probably lies more close towards the model of the Ulysses by James Joyce. Back in 1979, the French philosopher Jean-François Lyotard wrote one of the most important books about our postmodern condition, entitled The Postmodern Condition itself. And this book is famous because of his critique of the meta-narratives and so on. It's an important book within the work of philosophy and an important commentary on postmodernity itself. But one of the observations I think that is often overlooked is the fact that this was made as a report to the Canadian government. It was a report on knowledge, on the way that on epistemology itself. And one of the observations that Lyotard makes, which I think was incredibly prescient at the time, was the notion that somehow we have lost touch with the fundamental questions of why and how, and then have turned increasingly towards the whole domain of how much and how many. Quantification has become the dominant logic. And these days, of course, we have things like the citation index, which are counting the number of citations towards things, much like you might count the number of likes in an Instagram posting and so on. Does this say so much about things? To my mind, there is a danger that if you simply count things, you miss out on some of the underlying fundamental questions. the notion that somehow that writing, the style of writing, the way of writing is important to the notion of the critique that one is engaged on is fundamental to the work of people like Helen Sixu. Helen Sixu wrote her PhD in the domain of English literature and became a very important sort of theorist. One of the important comments that she makes is about the way of writing, and she in particular celebrates the notion of écriture féminine, as she calls it, which is not feminine writing as such, because some male authors might be able to write in a similar way. In fact, James Joyce is included as one of the examples of the best proponents of écriture féminine. Rather, it's about a certain sensibility that is conveyed in many ways by the writing itself. Sixu suffered from a withdrawal of funding in the 90s because the French social sciences did not think that her work was scientific enough. But perhaps the most famous figure from that domain is Jacques Derrida, who, contrary to the opinion of many people who view him as some kind of relativist, is far from that. Derrida is very famous for challenging every assumption, every way of operating, every form of that is kind of inscribed within the metaphysics of Western culture, and challenging those things, opening up an inquiry. For him, theory is not about presenting some kind of manifesto, some objective truth, but rather it's about questioning, continually critiquing and challenging the way that we think, that the way we see the world. And part of that, I would claim, is not just the subject itself, but also the way of operating, questioning the notion of these standard templates that are presented to us as the way in which we should do our doctoral thesis, and opening up the possibility of other modes of inquiry. The truth doesn't lie in some scientific experiment. Rather, it is out there, and it's for us to critique the ways in which we might get access to it. Perhaps the most famous commentator in some senses from the French tradition in terms of this kind of structure is Gilles Deleuze, a French philosopher who often teamed up with Felix Guattari, the psychoanalytic thinker. And Deleuze's work is fundamentally a critique of these controlling structures, the structures that you might find within scientific method. His whole concern is to see the world in terms of these kind of the competing domains, shall we say, of the territorialized versus the deterritorialized, of the striated, the structured, the controlled versus the smooth, of understanding ways of operating that don't necessarily follow a teleological logic, but rather have their own inherent logic. For him, the notion of the rhizome is the way in which we should approach the world, rather than the controlled structure, let's say, of the tree. To my mind, Deleuze is a wonderful model to think about the limitations and the constraints of humanities-based doctoral projects. What he seems to be calling for is an alternative approach, an approach that doesn't simply subscribe to given templates, to following the standard ways of operating, but one that searches a way of operating that is appropriate to the inquiry itself. And this, in many ways, is what humanities-based research is about. It is akin more to the writing of a book where things follow in a more discursive, natural way. They're not structured according to any form of scientific method or any other method. It's rather a challenging way of calling those into question. Now, while some may prefer to keep to the standard template, indeed, I would probably recommend it for weaker students. For stronger students, the challenge is to try and find a more appropriate interrogation. That doesn't mean to say there isn't any structure to this thing. I would say that on the whole, for any kind of thesis in the humanities, there needs to be some kind of introduction that sort of outlining the questions that have been addressed. Then there should be a main body of research of let's say from 3 to 6 chapters with a conclusion, which kind of presents in some ways the research findings. But as such, it is much more is less constrictive, it's much looser than the approach of a scientific-based doctoral project. Although the constraints needs to be defined, the steps clearly articulated, and the argument easy to follow. And I also think that some of the kind of the standard sort of logics that are often applied uncritically the notion of, let's say, of the literature review. Can any literature review be exhaustive? I've often found some very sort of trite and rather meaningless observations that have been brought on board because of the logic of the literature review. Clearly, of course, anyone researching in the field needs to know all the research that has been done in that area and may cite them on occasions. But to my mind, the literature review is a rather restrictive way of operating. So too, I would say, the idea of the case study, which often kind of tries to reduce things to a rather simplistic banality rather than engaging with the complexities of any situation. My advice from almost 30 years now of teaching doctoral candidates is to say, well, listen, maybe use illustrations of your argument, but don't try and base your argument on some kind of case studies, because that will inevitably fail in some way. There are other sort of standard procedures, such as interviews and so on, I think also need to be called into question, because they may remain in many ways highly subjective. In any case, we now live in a domain in which the world of data is providing us with much more meaningful information. So what I would say is that in terms of humanities, we should at least be open to the possibility that there is not any strict methodology that has to be adopted. The work obviously needs to adhere to a clearly defined epistemological frame. You've got to make explicit the way in which you're approaching your subject. But at the same time, we will also be careful. We don't need to present results so much as findings, inquiries, questions that have been raised that need to be in some senses presented in the conclusion. By way of my own conclusion, then, it seems to me we need to be adaptable. We should be careful and very cautious of following a set template, as though that is the only way of operating. And we need to be open to alternative mechanisms that are appropriate to the notion of research itself. And in the field of the humanities, I think that we should question not only the kind of the truths that are out there, but also the set templates that are often imposed in an uncritical fashion on the nature of a doctoral inquiry in the humanities.